Caro-Kann players, Caro-Kann Panov players, Alireza Firouzja fans, we got a treat for you today, or Anish Giri fans. I don't know if there's any of you out there. This is going to be a recent game between Anish Giri and Alireza Firouzja from the St. Louis Blitz event that just happened last month. Let's take note of this middle game and end game out of the Caro-Kann. This is a great game. We have e4, c6, d4, d5, e takes d, c takes d, c4. This is called the Caro-Kann Panov Botvinnik Attack. Knight f6, knight c3, e6. We do have a ChessGoals Caro-Kann course. At the end of this video, I'll tell you about the free course a little bit. There's a link in the description. We recommend bringing both knights out and keeping that pawn back. This is a perfectly fine setup. Knight f3, bishop to b4, pinning the knight. C takes d, knight takes d. Now, one of the things that you'll notice quite a bit in the Panov Botvinnik attack is in a lot of positions, white will have this isolated queen pawn for black to play against, or this b2 pawn will come to c3, and white will have what's called a hanging pawn structure, where there's a c and a d pawn, but no e pawn and no b pawn. So now we see bishop to d2 breaking the pin, knight c6, bishop d3, both sides castle. So what's the strategy here for each side? What Alireza would like to do is blockade this d4 pawn by putting a piece on the d5 square. The knight is already there, and if the knight gets captured, he would like to be able to capture it back with something besides this pawn. Because if the pawn has to capture, then both sides have the isolated queen pawn. So Alireza wants to control the d5 square, put pressure on the d4 pawn. So what's the strategy for Anish from the white side? He wants to utilize these pieces pointing towards the king side. He wants to create a king side attack, and this pawn in the center helps to grab space, which is a nice way to anchor that attack. Having space before you attack is always advantageous. Now we see bishop to e7 by Alireza. Strange looking retreat at first glance, but the bishop has done its job on b4. It's simply heading back to e7. It wants to go to f6, and from there it can pressure the isolated queen pawn. Queen e2 by Anish, connecting the rooks. So now the rooks are ready to come into the game. Sometimes in these positions, you're going to see queen to e4. It's a very common idea in the Panov Botvinnik. The idea with the queen on e4 is you threaten queen takes h7 checkmate. So it makes your opponent start to react. Are they going to get this queen e4 idea coming in? Black has to be thinking about it already. Bishop to f6. Let me turn off the arrows. The idea with bishop to f6 is to pressure this pawn. And if queen e4 here, pawn to g6 can be played. Rook a to d1. Anish is doing everything right so far, and according to the engine, he has about half a pawn advantage. I think that's because this bishop is still sort of a lousy piece, trapped in behind these pawns, and there's not enough compensation on the IQP yet. Now we see an inaccuracy by Alireza. I put a note in the comments. This is why we don't play the e6 line in the ChessGoals repertoire, the ChessGoals Caro-Kann course, because of this bishop problem. And b6 is an inaccuracy because Alireza is trying to figure out, how do I get that lousy bishop into the game? Knight e4, played by Anish. He returns the favor and gives up the advantage. The best move was queen to e4, threatening the checkmate. And after g6, knight takes d5, e takes d5. Black would have to accept that isolated queen pawn himself, and then queen to f4. It's a 0.9 stockfish advantage. White's going to push this h pawn up the board and still has all of these pieces well placed for a kingside attack. Look at all the pieces ready on the king side. This bishop is still a little bit shaky, and it really doesn't want to go to b7 now because it just runs into the pawn. So a miss by Anish. Should have played queen to e4. Instead, he plays knight to e4. And now we have bishop to b7 by Alireza. Their knight takes d4 was actually slightly stronger, but the problem is if he tries to grab this pawn, knight takes, bishop c1, now the initiative is definitely on white's side because the rook on d1 is starting to create problems down the d file, lined up with the bishop, the knight, the queen, and there's still kingside attacking potential with this knight maybe jumping over to g5 and the h7 pawn being vulnerable. So Alireza did not want to give up that initiative, and instead he goes bishop to b7. Knight takes f6 check played. But here, instead of knight takes f6, bishop to b1, slightly stronger. And this is one you can use in your own games to put the queen on d3 and then create the checkmate threat that way. So this is sort of a grandmaster move, but it's something you can utilize in your games. Knight takes f6 check played. Knight takes back. Bishop g5, creating a pin. Pawn to h6. Bishop retreats. Now we see a nice maneuver by Alireza. This is standard play against the IQP. You put the knight out on b4, and then it can come back to d5, creating that knight blockade that we talked about. Bishop c4. There it is, knight b to d5. This pawn is going nowhere, and it's going to become a weakness for a long time. Rook e1, rook c8. Now there's already a nasty threat. Alireza is looking to play knight to f4, hitting the queen, hitting the g2 pawn, and this bishop already cuts along the diagonal, pressuring the knight and g2 pawn. Bishop back to b3. Anish retreats because the queen was trying to guard this bishop. It's already being attacked by the rook. And once knight f4 comes, the queen has to figure out where can I move and still defend the bishop on c4. So this is a prophylactic move. He's preparing for knight to f4, which was played. Queen e3. Now knight to g6. Alireza has the advantage because we still have this isolated queen pawn. That's a weakness for Anish. And look at the position now for white. There's no pressure against the black king. Those bishops aren't lined up with the king anymore. Everything is looking pretty safe for black. Bishop back to g3. Knight to d5. One thing to note here. When you have an isolated queen pawn, usually it's good for the side that's fighting against the isolated queen pawn to swap off sets of minor pieces. So a bit stronger of a move here was actually bishop to d5 because it offers up the trade of bishops immediately, and one less set of minor pieces will favor Alireza in this position. But he plays knight d5, hitting the queen. Queen goes back. Knight goes back to e7. Knight e5. Knight e5 here does have a nice threat. So I just mentioned how the black king was looking pretty safe. Well, you have to be careful here because knight takes f7 is now a threat with the rook and bishop both attacking e6. So knight takes e5 played. And you might be wondering here, well, shouldn't Anish just take back with the pawn? Eliminate that isolated queen pawn? That's a good question. After the pawn takes back, there is bishop to d5. And if the bishops trade and the queens trade, compare this knight on d5 to the bishop on g3. The g3 bishop just runs into this pawn, whereas that knight is on a beautiful outpost in the center, and he looks at all of these advanced squares, does a great job blocking the rook. He's guarded by his buddy on e6. This is already a nice, clear advantage for black. So after knight takes e5, Anish decides, I'm going to take with the bishop. Knight to g6 played by Alireza. The bishop drops back, queen f6, clearing the way for a rook. Bishop back to c2. F3 was a little bit stronger, and we're going to see why after this next move, because in this position, knight to h4 could be played. That's a strong idea, pressuring the pawn on g2 and these light squares with the combination of the bishop. And it almost forces white to take, which trades off another set of minor pieces, which is going to in turn make this pawn even weaker. So bishop c2 played. f3 was a little bit stronger. And here knight h4 should be played. Alireza plays rook d8. Now f3, good move. Rook d7, a3. Doubles rooks on the d file. Bishop f2. And look at how Anish is stuck playing defense. You never want the bishop just stuck guarding a pawn like this. The eval right here is around minus 0.2, according to Stockfish. So not terrible for Anish, but really, Anish should never be able to win this position against Alireza. It's a 2-result position for black. Should be a win or a draw. But how does Alireza make progress here? That's the tough thing to figure out. He starts with knight h4, and there is a huge threat here. Knight takes f3, pawn takes back, and queen takes f3, threatening checkmate on g2 or checkmate on h1. So massive threat. Queen e3 played by Anish. The knight drops back to f5, hitting the queen, hitting the pawn. And one of the best moves is to simply take. But that's something that Alireza wanted, right? We wanted to get that trade, minor pieces. And this is where Alireza starts to go to work. There's currently one weakness in the position. These players are obviously super strong. One weakness usually isn't enough to convert a win. So what does black need to do here? He needs to create a second weakness in white's position. If you have two different weaknesses and you can switch back and forth targeting them, that's a much better way to play for a win than just really focusing on just that one weakness when your opponent can put all their resources into defending the weakness. So let's see, how does Alireza do that? Rook d2, rook c8, rook d1. And here we're going to see the players shuffle around a bit, but keep this theme in mind. If Alireza can push the A and the B pawns up the board and create a queenside weakness in addition to the d4 pawn weakness, that's how he's going to play for the win. So keep that in mind while we go through the shuffling. Okay, both sides moving the pieces around a little bit, trying to make progress. Alireza gets their rooks on the open file, which is nice. Pawn to f6, prophylactic move that prevents anything from coming into e5 by white. Queen drops back, rook c1, rook back to c4, a5. Now we start to see what's happening. Alireza controls the c file. He's still focused on putting a little pressure on the d pawn, and all of these pieces for white are playing defense currently. Now these pawns start to come up on the queen side, and Alireza is going to create that second weakness. Queen e3, pawn b5. Queen back to f2. And in this position, the best move, just try to slow Alireza down, was actually bishop d6, trying to help guard against the queen side. But instead he goes queen f2. Pawn b4. Here come the pawns. A takes b, a takes b, queen e3. Now here it's a tough move to find. The best move in the position is rook 4 back to c6. It's a stronger move than what was played in the game because this move in the game, rook c2, actually increases the drawing chances for Anish because he's able to hold on to the b pawn a little bit longer. Rook takes c2, rook takes c2, rook e2. Very nice combo by Anish. He's trying to trade off rooks, make sure he doesn't create a second weakness. Rook c8. And now after the rook cleared off of c2, there's this cool idea, queen to b1. And from b1, the queen highlights all the way across the first rank because this rook wants to come back to c1 with the help of the queen, threatening checkmate. Queen d2 played, threatening to pick up the pawn. b3, great move by Alireza. It's secured by the bishop. And now we do see the two weaknesses come into play. Rook to c2 is a threat. Queen to b1 is a threat. What does Anish do here? He makes a mistake. The best moves were queen d1 or queen e1, trying to prevent this queen from sneaking down into b1. Instead, he goes rook f2, queen b1 played, and now the threat is either rook c2 or rook c1. This is going to be a devastating endgame attack. Queen b4, rook c1, threatening mate. Anish goes bishop d6, creating an escape square, but it's actually a checkmate in 3 moves with best play. Rook check, king g3, queen g6 check, and the game could have continued king f4 and queen g5 mate, but Alireza resigned, or excuse me, Anish resigned after queen g6 check. So what a nice game coming out of the Caro-Kann Panov. We got to see how to play against an IQP, take it all the way to the end game. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to subscribe, hit the thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.